The Federal Plan for Equitable Long-Term Recovery and Resilience commits federal agencies to strengthen the vital conditions needed to improve nationwide well-being. It's a government-wide approach to bring to bear the huge breadth of federal resources to improve resilience at the individual and community level. My guest today is Becky Payne, who led the development of the plan in 2021 and is now president and CEO of the Rippel Foundation, whose vision is a cohesive system of health that focuses on health and well-being, a system that is thriving, equitable, and sustainable. Hi, everyone. I'm David Williams, president of strategy consulting firm HealthBiz Group and host of the HealthBiz podcast, a weekly show where I interview top healthcare leaders about their lives and careers. If you enjoy this episode, please press that like button and subscribe. Becky, welcome to the HealthBiz podcast.
Thank you for having me, David. It's great to be here.
So I already see the theme is that you work on things with lofty ambitions.
Very astute. Yes, that characterizes my career so far. Thank you.
Sounds pretty good. Well, we'll get to the career part in a minute. I'd love to hear a bit about your background, your upbringing, any childhood influences that may stay with you today.
I love this question. And I think, we talk about bringing our whole selves to our work as change agents. So it's a wonderful place to start. And I had the good fortune of being raised by public servants, which explains my trajectory into a career of federal service. My father was in law enforcement and was actually an elected official for all of my upbringing. My mother was a social worker by training and worked for family court. And so you can just imagine the conversations around my dinner table. And there were very few divisions between family time and community time. And so I was really brought up hearing about the influence of the systems in which people were raised and the inequities in terms of opportunity and how different systems treated different people. And my parents were often problem solving together around who they knew in the community and the various committees they served in, their volunteerism for how to help families in need, but also whole groups of neighborhoods and communities that we were surrounded by. And I really grew up with that spirit of it is all of our responsibility to seek to try to give back, to embrace our common humanity and find solutions for communities to come together. And that has been something that's really driven me through my career.
Yeah, not surprisingly, people are very influenced by their upbringing. And so, people don't have the opportunity to, in most cases, to choose who their parents are, but at least they have the opportunity to benefit from it and to make the most of it. So that sounds like a very clear, cogent explanation of how your career came to pass. In terms of education, when you started to make your own choices in terms of college and so on, what path did you choose? What were you thinking there?
So I was interested in health. I did not know what public health was, I'll say, when I was going through my undergraduate career, but I had the good fortune of being able to create my undergraduate programming. It was interdisciplinary studies. I was in the College of Social Science, and I was able to take all kinds of courses that touched health, that touched social justice, philosophy, business courses, and being able to, at an early kind of start in my education, think about how do all those different pieces, those different disciplines approach problems. It really gave me the foundations of what I still do today, which is serve as a translator, to understand that different people have different training, they have different drivers, they're looking for different things, they bring different tools and assets to a conversation, but really being able to study across all of those different disciplines helped me. And it was a health-focused degree in public policy. So that really started my path toward thinking, there are medical careers, which I toyed with at one point, where you're working with an individual. And then there are opportunities to say, I'm really hungry to try to impact as many people with a given strategy at one time as possible. And I really did get that in my education. I did go on to get a master's in public health. It was in community health sciences. I specifically chose a program that had a practicum instead of a paper. So I've always been sort of wanting to be in the community and able to practice in the field on the ground. And so I had a degree program that really allowed me to do that and exposed me to lots of different perspectives along the way.
Well, it seems like you spent most of your career at the federal level, but I think you started at the Louisiana Office of Public Health, if I've got that right. What was
Yeah,
that
I
like?
did. And even prior to that, I was a crisis counselor during my undergraduate years in a domestic violence shelter. And so that was sort of the earliest time when I started to really get frustrated with the one-off kind of, again, identifying where are the systems not working, well-intentioned systems, well-intentioned services not serving people. And then when I went to the Office of Public Health in Louisiana, really had the good fortune to be on the early line of the early years of the Healthy Communities Initiative. And that framework of helping communities kind of come together, think collectively about their vision of how they want to grow their economy, grow health and well-being in their community, what a healthy community looks like in its broadest sense. That seed was planted for me when I was in Louisiana. I had the good fortune being in Louisiana, trying to retain talent in a state that has sometimes a drain on talent. Was recruited to stay and was the state's first workforce development director. But in that role, I oversaw the early days. So this was pre 9/11, to date myself, bioterrorism response planning grants from CDC. And even back then, we were talking about, this is the late 90s, we were talking about using those federal dollars to invest in what was then the crumbled, disinvested public health system. And so we used that money to oversee investments in lab and epidemiology, in planning and preparedness, the earliest days of distance technology for training, trying to bring capacity up among the public health workforce. It's sort of extraordinary to look back on that and see that in many ways, we're still having those conversations and reeling from the impacts of not doing that to completion even back then. So that really gave me a chance to, again, continue connecting dots, bridging disciplines. And then I was attracted to CDC, continuing some of that work in bioterrorism preparedness and response, but with a focus on workforce development, giving our public health workforce access to the kind of skills and tools they needed to solve today's problems. And then 9/11 hit, the world changed. I grew up with a first responder. I wasn't interested in continuing to be a first responder. It wasn't what drew me into public health. So I moved around the agency. The short version is I probably worked in all but one of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, including the Office of the Director, where I was constantly called in to try to help create things that had not happened before, to problem solve, again, bridge across our scientific community, our policy community, our programmatic community, and help people think differently and design solutions depending on what the task was in the moment.
Got it. All right. Well, that's a pretty good explanation. I was going to say at first that you were one of the few that jumped right into saying, I want to help more people. And it usually starts with you've got some sort of a frustration from working on one-on-one, but actually you had that too if you're working as a crisis counselor. So it sounded like you got all sides of it. You know, within CDC, which is obviously a large place, you've got all these different departments, different centers, as you were saying. But then there's the broader piece now, maybe leading into, you know, what you did on this long-term recovery and resilience. And I've been involved in some things where, you know, you've got all these federal agencies under HHS, you know, CDC, NIH, HRSA, FDA, and they have in some ways overlapping or at least, you know, related missions, but they don't always act that well together. And sometimes, in fact, it's, you know, that the whole is less than the sum of the parts, at least from what I've seen. So how, you know, obviously this opportunity came up in 2021, it sounds like, on long-term recovery and resilience. Had you had interagency experience before that, or what was your kind of perception of how CDC relates to the broader federal infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, public health inherently, you know, we like to say we have a classic role of being a convener. So it is, it gives you opportunity to branch out and work across agencies to varying degrees. And I had certainly had the chance to do that in multiple assignments in my time at CDC. I also served in the Office of the Director as Deputy Chief of Staff during the Ebola crisis and through Zika and through some of those very trying times. And in that role, often reached across definitely HHS, but also other component parts of the federal government. But the LTRR, before it was that lovely long acronym, really started actually in the spring of 2020, partly by virtue of my background working in the office of the director previously, and work that I was doing at CDC at the time. I was, as we said, deployed as part of the COVID response in March of 2020 to the Unified Command. If you recall, we had a public health emergency,
Sure.
Which shifted the.
We still have it for another couple months.
We had an official declaration in March, right. And so that shifted the leadership, the agency that was leading the response, to FEMA. And so I was asked to go to Washington, D.C. to help establish one of the task forces. At the time, the task force focused on community mitigation and working across my fellow agencies there. In the course of doing that, if we all remember what was happening spring of early days of the pandemic in 2020, of course, we were witnessing the disparities, we were witnessing the behavioral health crisis, the substance use crisis that was happening. And so we were tasked, the task force I was leading, was asked to take on an objective related to addressing the behavioral and substance use crisis, among other things in our portfolio. And I said, we will gladly take it. And given my background in community and community health sciences, I quickly said, if we are going to do this and do this well, we are going to try to approach this in a manner that is not simply, and that simply is an understatement, I don't want to diminish it, but we are not only going to talk about treatment and a flood of resources to fix the crisis. We have to have an honest conversation about the fact that the disparities we are seeing, the long lines at food banks, the economic turmoil that people were experiencing in some communities before the virus ever reached that geography, that this is not about the pandemic. This was actually about our failure to invest in the systems that create the conditions for health and well-being long before, decades before the pandemic. And so that gave birth to an approach that required calling on more than the health and social services agencies, but really saying we need to talk about all of federal government. We need to talk about the lessons we're learning, in particular, the intersections of our various agencies and the opportunities that might exist for us to truly transform the way government works and work in better synergy, to use an overused word, together, and to dream differently. It was an extraordinarily frustrating time, heartbreaking time to be both part of the solution and the response, but also to, if we were honest, recognize if you had spent time as a career federal official, you were also part of the problem. At some point, at any given moment, when had any of us failed to rise to the moment to choose differently, to make a different policy decision, to ask a hard question of our leadership and deploy the assets of the federal government in a way that would have been of better service to our communities? And so, I consider it a great privilege to have been in a space to help shape that, to sit in conversation with my fellow public servants. We structured that very intentionally to not have any political level appointed officials. We were career officials who have to transcend administrations and who have seen a lot and are always responsible for executing the vision of a given administration, but in actuality, executing what we call steady state assets and resources that Congress empowers us with on any given day under any administration. So that was the genesis of what became the LTRR. I think it's extraordinary to think about what is now over 45 agencies coming together, sitting in conversation for now 3+ years, transcending administrations and crafting a set of recommendations that, if our leaders continue to have the courage to implement them and discuss how to make them a reality, it really is an unprecedented moment of returning government back to our communities and back to the people.
One of the things that is part of this LTRR I've seen is this vital conditions framework. And can you explain, first of all, what that is and why that is such a necessary part of this, bringing everyone together.
So we, of course, did what bureaucrats do. We looked at lots of frameworks. We looked at resiliency frameworks. We looked at emergency response frameworks. We looked at, of course, the social determinants of health. And when we came down to it, we had also reached out to partners in civil society because we said this is bigger than government. Government alone is not going to solve these problems. And so it was really our partners in civil society who had been working through over many years, thinking about how to make the social determinants of health more actionable, have broader appeal and uptake outside of health sectors, who had given birth to this vital conditions framework. And so when we were exposed to that and really put it through all the pressure testing of what we were trying to accomplish with this plan, the vital conditions checked all of the boxes in ways none of those other frameworks did. Most importantly, it centered belonging and civic muscle, which anchored us in equity. If you remember, we were all witnessing those incredible disparities, and so that was a really important component. It also immediately brought people to the table who otherwise might not be brought to the table to solve a health problem. So our partners in transportation, our partners in the Department of Commerce, our partners in our museums and our libraries, everybody saw their agency's mission in one way or another in that framework. So I didn't have to convince anybody that there was an opportunity to do better. The other thing that it does is it talks about sort of a hopeful but yet pragmatic approach to what are the conditions that need to exist that will allow health and well-being to flourish if we are to invest in them. It doesn't talk about the things that you don't need. It talks about the future we're trying to create. And the 7 conditions, if you look into them more carefully, there are attributes. So it's pretty tangible what counts and what doesn't, and what we are suggesting people can help contribute to.
You talked about, your role long-term as a translator, and different people have different needs and so on. And I think it's connected with this. I was reading one of your articles that you co-authored in Health Affairs, and it's talking about social determinants of health. And I want to read you a couple lines and just see if you can unpack it a little bit for me. So it's mentioning that, even ardent champions of social determinants of health concede the emphasis on non-medical factors can be more antagonizing than unifying. And by explicitly anchoring in health, social determinants framing may inadvertently alienate crucial allies. So I kind of, and I'm coming from the healthcare side myself. So is it sort of that, you take social determinants and say, well, we're focusing on what we're doing for health, but, we got to bring everything else into it and put ourselves at the center? Is that the concern, or what's say a little bit more about what's the alienating element of it and antagonizing?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And one of the questions I got a lot through this process, and we continue to get today, which is part of why we put that piece out in Health Affairs, is were we pitting the two against each other? Were we pitting vital conditions against the social determinants of health? And that is not at all the case. It's what we're talking about in the kind of unintended consequence of anchoring these non-medical factors in the social determinants of health is that it creates health as kind of the cost of entry into the conversation. It says, you know what? Yes, there are benefits for you in education, but really what we're going to talk about is what are you going to do to improve health? And I think that today of all times, we can see the burdens on our school systems, the burdens on our infrastructure and our transportation systems. We're witnessing that in real time right now play out with environmental crises. And so to say, you have your own mission, your own set of responsibilities, but I want to have a conversation about what you can do for me, which at its most makes it an antagonistic conversation, sort of shuts down things, rather than saying, you know what, we all care about the same thing. We all care about giving our contributions, our gifts, if you will, from our field, our sector to our community and creating something for the people in our community and recognizing that they fit together. Tinkering in transportation is going to have an impact on the economy, and tinkering, as we saw, tinkering with the economy for health reasons created some pretty drastic effects, some that could be anticipated, some maybe that we were a little bit blind to. And so the idea of the vital conditions being about the conditions really opens the door as a bridging conversation to say, I'm open. I'm open to hearing about what you are experiencing, what you can contribute, and how we have intersecting alignment, and where a tweak that I may be making in my sector has maybe an additive effect or an unintended negative effect or a detraction in what you're trying to accomplish. And that is when you open up and unlock people's conversations and ability to contribute their assets and do problem solving. When you come at it from if you do this, you are affecting me this way, you immediately put people on the defensive. The other thing about the social determinants of health is, for some people, they hear that and they think, oh, it's done. My zip code dictates my health.
Right.
We've all heard that. It's an effective and a persuasive argument for some. For others, it's very defeating, and it can make you feel like you're done before you even start. And so I give up. So vital conditions really is not about displacing the social determinants of health, but it helps. We have found, and we've witnessed this in many communities, I witnessed it across all of that interagency effort, it creates an opportunity to talk about what are the practical solutions we can put in place in order to actually improve those social determinants of health. And it completely flips the script.
Great. That's very interesting. Well, we'll talk about complexity in a minute, but there's a lot involved in what you just said. So we'll let it sink in. Let's talk about your current employer, which is the Rippel Foundation. I assume is it pronounced Rippel or some other
Rippel.
way? Rippel is nice. I think it'd be Repel or something. But what is the foundation? I mean, as I was looking at it, it seems pretty closely connected with what you were doing before. So what is it? How'd you get interested in it?
That's great. So the Rippel Foundation is a foundation where we work with other change makers. Sometimes we refer to them as stewards, who kind of share our vision of a future where all people can thrive. We call that our North Star. We work with them to help create the conditions that I've just been talking about, where people can come together, sometimes in a health system, sometimes in a region, across multiple sectors, and really help them create the space to have conversations that allow them to change mindsets, open mindsets, and talk about how they can collectively shift investments away from what we refer to as urgent services. So those things that people need when they're in crisis, but aren't going to actually create long-term investments in health and well-being. We're able to, through our tools and our frameworks and the learning that we've done over many decades with other change makers, help them have conversations in a different way than they may have had in patterns over time. And really it is about exposing them to the vital conditions, exposing them to complexity, which you teased, exposing them to thinking about the future, not in 2 and 3 year increments, but really kind of in the next decade, if we want to see real systems transformation and have that be anchored in equity. What do we need to understand? And we help them do that through the use of our kind of coaching and walking alongside of them.
It sounds like the Rippel Foundation's been around for a long time, and certainly the healthcare world has changed over that time. I saw it looks like there was kind of a reset at one point with a Rethink Health initiative. Let's talk a little bit about how the organization evolved, what Rethink was and is, how it relates to where you're taking things from here.
We've actually been around. This is our 70th year. We're celebrating our birthday this year. Thank you. But about 15 years ago, we did have this pivot you're referring to, where we literally rethought everything, and in that process created our flagship initiative of Rethink Health. And that was really taking the moment to step back and say, we are, by many standards, a small foundation. We were a traditional grant giving foundation at that time. And we were focused on the same things we're focused on now, hospital systems and securing health and well-being among specific populations. And we were doing that through traditional grant making. But the power and the impact of small grants over time was but a drop in the bucket up against the big health issues of our time. And so we brought in thinkers across, it's going to sound very familiar to my history, across many different disciplines and sectors to say, if you were going to try to tackle really getting upstream for the population writ large, how would you approach this problem? And that is how Rethink Health was born. And we've taken that view of looking to the future on a long time horizon, trying to anticipate the kinds of skills and decisions that are going to be needed to realize a very different future, understanding the legacies that create the conditions we're experiencing now, and how do we need to think differently and shape different legacies, owning the injustices that exist, healing from them, honoring them, but then also trying to choose differently so that we don't keep repeating that injustice, and continuing to learn and adapt over time. So we are kind of in a constant state of rethinking, which is why it works for us, but really bringing that to our partners and others. So that pivot about 15 years ago caused us to stop using our endowment to give grants and start using our endowment to allow us to have a broader lens, try to create influence in those other change makers who can have a broader impact than us, grant by grant by grant.
Got it. So it's obviously what you're doing is related to what you were doing with the LTRR, but are you explicitly involved in some way in helping to implement it? Or is it just this sort of the same type of thinking with some of the same people?
So I mentioned the vital conditions framework, and when we had reached out to civil sector partners, by chance, I did not know about Rethink or the Rippel Foundation at the time, and became exposed to them through that work of the LTRR. And so when the opportunity arose to join the Rippel Foundation, it was just a gift to me to be able to think about continuing to keep doing this work that fills me up, that I think is so critical and really is going to be the antidote to our divisive times. And so that is how I came to find Rippel. We do continue to be in conversation with our federal partners. We support and applaud the work of the LTRR, and we are, very vocal about the work is not done, that actually making good on the recommendations that are in that plan is going to take, day after day choosing to work differently. And our career officials need support to do that. It is not a natural thing in the federal government, as much as I wish it was, to work across agencies. As you alluded to early in our conversation, they need to know that it is both expected and it will be supported, and that it doesn't mean that we're duplicating effort, which is the thing Congress worries about. It means that we are actually maximizing our investments. And there's a way to do that that doesn't require new budgetary initiatives or new authorities, but simply allowing federal agencies to work together in more natural ways. So we continue to stay connected to that. We will continue to be thought partners. We will continue to be critics when we need to be critics, but we are also really actively identifying the places and finding the stories where that action is happening on the ground and the early signs of success take hold. And we will amplify those and put them out so that others can take inspiration from them.
So Becky, you spent quite a lot of time at, large governmental agencies, and then in the final role sort of across even, a broader set of, just huge amounts of number of people and spending and complexity and career people working for political appointees and all that was involved in the, in the past few years at the national level. What's it like now to be at a place that you'd said, is doing important work and has been around a long time, but you hadn't even necessarily heard of? It's a quieter, smaller place. What are the pros and cons from your own perspective?
That's a great question. I think one of the biggest pros for me is really being able to align work that I think is so important with every day. In federal government, especially the way my career unfolded, I had a new assignment every few years. I never knew when that tap on the shoulder was going to come. And I had the opportunity to circle around this kind of work a few times in really rewarding ways. But this to me was an opportunity to stick with this and stick with it for a long time. So in that way, it's extremely rewarding and wonderfully aligned. It's also daunting. I find myself leading an organization that has a rich history, a tremendous reputation, and incredible contributions already. And I also see opportunities for us to have an even bigger impact. And so really right now, my focus is on helping to support our organization to continue to be stable and healthy in all the ways that a CEO has to do: our finances, our talent, our partnerships, are a clear message to the outside world so that they can understand what we're asking of them and help bring them to commit to that. At the same time, I think, I'm learning a lot. I'm new to philanthropy. I'm new to this size of organization. And so I'm trying to also be very patient and hear from our staff and our team. We have so many tremendous resources that have been developed over time that in some ways, I think, like a lot of startups, are trapped within our vault. And so I think you'll see over the next year a lot more writing, a lot more tools and resources making their way out into the world. That's the luxury we have as a foundation, is that we exist to give our things away and to put that knowledge out and have that uptake. So that's really, I'm having fun, but I know, I have a long learning curve in terms of being in a new sector.
That's good. Well, it'll be healthy. You'll stay young and fresh as a result of that opportunity. I have a last question for you, which is whether you've had a chance to read any good books lately, anything that you would recommend, or conversely, anything that you recommend people avoid.
Oh, I won't talk so much about what people should avoid. I will say my to-read list is always far longer than my recently read list. But in the last year, Sean Ginwright's The Four Pivots has really stayed with me. And I would recommend that for anyone in working to change systems, in the health system in particular. It resonates with the work we do at Rippel, and on a personal level in the work that I'm committed to working on with myself. And I really think he does such a phenomenal job of laying out what I think is an anecdote to our divisive times in many ways. He talks about really looking within as much as we focus outwardly. And he challenges us not to speak of the problems we're trying to upend, but to really be clear about what we think the possibilities are and what a more just system would look like. And I think that's a really, it's a powerful challenge. It's not easy work to take on unjust systems, but it is in some ways much harder to think in the positive frame of, I'm not just trying to undo something, but I have a view of what creating a better path forward would look like. So I really can't, I've recommended that book to many, and to a person, they come back and say it changed the way they're thinking. They've taken action just after reading it. So I love that book.
Great. Okay, that's a good answer. Well, Becky Payne, President and CEO of the Rippel Foundation, thank you for joining me today on the HealthBiz Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to the HealthBiz Podcast with me, David Williams, President of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.